happy to welcome here to the broadcast Jim Gottstein, the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. We love having you on the broadcast because you come armed with great information about a topic that I just never hear anything about, and that is the whole concept of drugging your kid instead of raising your kid.
Mm-hmm.
How big of a problem is this?
Well, the biggest problem is really poor children, children on Medicaid, who are 9 times more likely than children not on Medicaid to be given psychiatric drugs. And then children in state custody, such as foster care, are 4 times more likely than the rest of Medicaid children to be given psychiatric drugs. And we're not just talking about the stimulants like Ritalin anymore. Now we're talking about the most heavy-duty drugs,
like what?
The neuroleptics like Zyprexa and Risperdal. Risperdal has been in the news recently because it causes this condition called gynecomastia, which is little boys growing breasts and lactating, and there have been a series of lawsuits, a couple hundred against Johnson & Johnson about this, and they've been settling them right and left. And
what's the name of that drug?
It's called Risperdal.
And what does it do?
Yeah.
It's I call them neuroleptics. They are marketed as antipsychotics. Maybe you've heard of Zyprexa. Maybe you've heard of Thorazine.
No.
Or Haldol.
No.
Well, these drugs were approved for adults diagnosed with schizophrenia, and that's why they're called antipsychotics. But they don't really have much antipsychotic property. What they really do is they're literally a chemical straitjacket. They block 70 to 90% of the dopamine in the frontal lobes. So a chemical lobotomy, I mean. And so what they do is people are acting out, being, disturbing, and so they clamp them down with these drugs.
And what does it do to their, it shuts off, in layman's terms, what does it physically do to them?
Well, they do a lot of things, but the main effect that is considered therapeutic is that they block 70 to 90% of the dopamine in
what does
frontal
dopamine do?
It's one of these neurotransmitters in your brain. And
so does it make you emotionless?
Yes, well, really what it does, it disables you. And so whatever it is that is causing you to be disturbing, you can't do that anymore. So like if you hear voices, some people it does actually kind of stop the voices. But for most people, it maybe suppresses them a little bit, but mostly it just makes people so apathetic they don't care about the voices anymore. And so the main thing is they're easier to control.
So you lose drive, you lose ambition, you lose a zest for life, you become zombie-like.
Exactly. And people sit, I had a client someone I knew, and I saw her in the hospital when she got pulled in. She was literally strapped to a wheelchair so she wouldn't fall out and drooling. And this was a vibrant woman. And so that's what they do. People act in a disturbing manner. And so it's a chemical lobotomy or chemical straitjacket.
And these drugs are forced upon these folks?
On adults, yes. And what's happened is the drug companies, they're very unpleasant drugs. And so the drug companies have focused on marketing to people that do not get to say no. So these are adults in the psychiatric system diagnosed with schizophrenia that are forced to take it, the elderly in nursing homes. And what happens is, and there's a black box warning on these drugs for the elderly, that they double the death rate. But what happens is people in the nursing homes, they can't complain anymore when they're on these drugs. They can't get out of bed. And then they die. And so someone comes in and, they say, well, my mother, she was walking around and doing stuff, and now she can't out of bed. Oh, well, you can't get out of bed. Oh, well, your mother's old. And then she dies, and they say, oh, well, your mother was old. And so, but these elderly in nursing homes don't really get to say no anymore. And that's true of children, too, and especially poor children.
And what's the impact on children?
Well, it's a grand experiment or a horrific experiment, because nobody knows. These drugs were studied basically for 6 weeks, and then they give them long term. But we know they cause structural changes in the brain. We know they cause brain shrinkage. We know that...
What do they do to the suicide rate of young people?
Increase it.
Significantly?
Yes.
Because they just lose hope?
Well, there's a couple of things. That's part of it, but they also cause this condition called akathisia, which is this inner restlessness where people are literally driven crazy by these drugs, and they can't sit still. They get up and walk, pace around, and they sit down and stuff, and people jump off bridges to get away from it, and
Well,
people
Jim,
become violent.
Let's just cut to the chase here. Is this employment of drugs because the psychiatrists have a guaranteed result? In other words, if a parent comes to the child and says, my child's misbehaving, I can't control my child, the psychiatrist knows that, well, the easy way is just to drug the child, and it's just the easy way out. Is that what's driving this?
It is, and the thing is, that only works for the short term. It doesn't really work long term. And so it's a quick fix, but in the end, basically it causes far more problems.
So why are we just treating the symptoms with drugs instead of getting down to the roots of problems?
I think Dan is really focused on it, which is a quick fix part. Because when you look at a child, let's look at a child in foster care. The reason why a child is in foster care is there's been a determination that he or she was a subject of abuse or neglect. That is a legal reason to bring someone into foster care. Okay, so that child's going to be upset, right? There's things that were going on at home that were so bad that the state decided they had to yank them out of their home. Well, being yanked out of the home is going to make that child or youth upset too, okay? And then oftentimes these foster placements are pretty horrific. So that's going to get that child upset. And so instead of helping that child or youth deal with all these problems, we just say there's something wrong with your brain and drug them into oblivion. And so what we need to do is take the time. I think that's the main thing, is we don't take time with people. People need some time, and they need some support, and children need love, and they need role models and those kind of things. And we just don't, we're not willing to make that kind of investment in our children and youth.
Go ahead.
Would you say drug companies are exploiting this because they know that, or because they really believe that they're doing the best thing in these unfortunate circumstances?
Oh, I think they're doing it completely for the profit motive. I mean, I was talking about these Risperdal cases. The lawyer in that case, by the name of Stephen Scheller, recently filed a petition, which is a formal complaint. It's not like a regular petition where people sign, with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to revoke the approval of the use of Risperdal in children because of all these things that are known, including the gynecomastia, the growing of breasts. But one of the things that he said was that in the course of the litigation, he had privy to all these internal documents from Johnson & Johnson that were far worse than has been disclosed publicly, and that he wasn't allowed to disclose them because of the secrecy in the court proceedings.
Well, you think about any company, if you can get a situation where that someone is mandated to use your product, that's like the ultimate, that's the perfect business model, right? And that's what these drug companies have.
Right, and they say that people have to use them for the rest of their lives. They don't cure anybody. In fact, we had this protest in Washington, D.C. In July, and a former president of the American Psychiatric Association said, well, these drugs they're imperfect, they don't cure anybody. Basically, they're just suppressing symptoms.
Isn't this a part of our culture, though, Jim? Don't we as a culture medicate ourselves? You know, drugs, alcohol, whatever. There's workaholics. we're always trying to avoid pain. Isn't that kind of our culture in America?
Yeah, I think it is.
So isn't this just kind of an extension of this?
Well, just because it's part of the culture doesn't necessarily mean it's okay, really. And I think to be forcing these drugs on people, the elderly and children and other people, is really immoral.
Yeah.
And there's a study now, it's, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, that came out that was conducted by the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors that found that people diagnosed with serious mental illness in the public mental health system are dying 25 years earlier than the rest of the population. 25
That's
years. The physical effects of these drugs are so bad. And to me, the fact that there's not an uproar about the way these drugs are killing people just shows how despised this group of people are, or how little society cares about them.
What's the alternative?
Well, there are lots of alternatives. I mean, in terms of children, there's this marvelous website called criticalthinkrx.org, criticalthinkrx.org. And Module 8 of that, it's a curriculum designed for people working with children and youth to determine whether or not the drug should be used. But Module 8 is a description of all these programs, non-drug programs that have shown to be effective in helping children. And basically, we need to teach children how to be successful. Rather than say there's something wrong with them, we need to help. That's what parenting is all about. That's what raising a child is all about, whether it's the parent, teachers, you know, the community. It used to be, you know, we said this saying, you know, it takes a village to raise a child, and we don't really have that village interaction anymore, and so we need to be doing those sorts of things. So, you know, you need to help children basically be successful, learn how to control their emotions rather than, you know, flail out and hit or bite and, you know, or scream and yell. You know, learn how to regulate your emotions.
Parent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then for adults, there's this program in Finland called in part of Finland, I think it's Western Lapland, called the Open Dialogue Approach. And they virtually eliminated schizophrenia in that part of Finland because they have an approach where they go in, they don't put people in the hospital, they don't give them drugs, they don't give everybody drugs, they give some people drugs, but they try not to. And they say the problem isn't really in the designated person, it's really in the situation. And they go in, and in order to get properly diagnosed with schizophrenia, you have to have these symptoms for 6 months. And they get people through their psychosis and back onto their lives, so much that the rate of schizophrenia has plummeted. The rest of Finland is just as bad as everywhere else in the Western world.
Are we beginning to take notice of that here in the United States?
Starting to, and we actually have this program in Alaska, which I helped found, called Soteria Alaska, which is a little bit different. But the key to both of those is to get people before they get put down on this road of the drugs, because once they've been put on these drugs for any length of time, you've got this whole host of other problems, which is withdrawal from these very addictive drugs.
Yeah. I want to ask you, we'll take a break, but when we come back, I want to ask you about how many kids are on drugs, these kind of drugs, in Alaska. Do we even know? We'll talk about that with Jim Gottstein, who is with the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights. We'll be back with Jim right after this. Stay with us, folks. All right, welcome back to the broadcast. We're talking to Jim Gottstein, who is with the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, talking about drugging kids, not loving them. Is that too simplistic, or?
No, I think we do need to love kids, not drug them.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and it is an epidemic. Do we have any idea how many kids in Alaska are on psychiatric drugs?
You know, I haven't really seen those numbers, but one thing I can tell you is that I've been working with this marvelous group of foster youth and alumni, they call them, called Facing Foster Care in Alaska. I've gone to some of their retreats, and virtually every one of them has been given psychiatric drugs.
Every single one?
Almost every one.
I don't understand that.
Well, here's what happens is, we were talking about the emotional traumas that children have to get them into foster care, and so they tend to have, a lot of them have disturbing behaviors that bother the adults in their lives.
Right.
But one of the things that happens is that when they come into the system, they automatically have a mental health assessment.
Yes.
Okay, so then you're kind of funneling them right at the get-go into the, quote, the mental health system. And
Yes.
there's nationally, 95% of the children that see a child psychiatrist come away with a prescription.
95%? That's just crazy. Is the psychiatrist paid extra? Is there an incentive?
Oh, yes. What happens is that the old-fashioned therapy, the 55-minute hour, or really it's 45-minute hour, they get paid X amount. But if they do a 15-minute med check, they get to get 3 people in an hour instead of 1 person
So they don't
in an
actually
hour.
have to counsel the child. They just drug the child.
Oh,
and
there's
it's less time consuming.
There's virtually no counseling by psychiatry anymore. It's all
Are you
about.
serious?
And what happened is that in the 70s, what happened is the psychiatric profession had a lot of competition on counseling, because you've got psychologists and social workers and other kinds of family therapists starting to compete with them on the therapy. But they were medical doctors, MDs, so they had prescribing privileges.
Yes.
And so what they did is they turned it into, that this is a medical condition.
Right.
I mean, they never really should have been medical doctors in the first place, because from my perspective, what I think about it is that they're pretending to be real doctors.
Right.
And, I'm very critical of the psychiatric profession
Yes.
as a whole. I mean, there's some good ones.
95% of them are just using drugs, why don't they just send them to pharmacists? Well, really, why even go to a psychiatrist? Just go to the pharmacist. Anybody can prescribe drugs.
Right.
I can do that.
And as a society, we grant these monopoly prescribing privileges to doctors in exchange for the commitment from them that they are going to objectively evaluate the evidence and make recommendations regarding what's in the best interest of their patient. And they have totally abdicated their obligation to that. They've totally breached that, because what they've done is they've basically just bought into this pharmaceutical company marketing, because it really serves their financial interests.
Do they get paid, the psychiatrists get paid from these pharmaceutical companies based upon how many prescriptions they write?
Well, it's not quite like it's pretty close to that. In fact, one of those, what did I just downloaded yesterday. Abbott with Depakote. They recently settled a criminal case for the off-label marketing of Depakote, which is an anti-seizure drug that is marketed as, quote, a mood stabilizer. And there was this agreed statement of facts where they pled guilty to this crime. And one of the things they talked about was all these payments to doctors. And one of the things that they do is doctors are required to have continuing medical education. And so they'll pay for that, and then they'll pay doctors to talk to other doctors. And so, yes, there's all this money going. And
even if there wasn't a direct connection to compensation to the drug companies, just the idea that you can get a patient in and out in 15 minutes as opposed to sitting down and actually working with that patient, that in and of itself is financial incentive enough, because you can just plow through patients.
Right.
That's really, I would imagine, the big incentive financially, wouldn't it be?
Yes, it is. I mean, yeah. And so,
What, Jim, why, other than you, and I'm sure there are others who work with you, but why is this not really covered in the media? Why don't we hear this and see this more often?
well, you know, you can, and I think there's a lot of truth to this. I've even had people in the media tell me this, is that there's so much drug company advertising money. I mean, it seems like every third advertisement on TV is for
For the same reason you don't see on local television news investigative stories on car dealerships.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's right. Okay, so I brought this book,
Yes.
Drugging Our Children. There are actually a lot of people who are writing about this stuff, but it's not getting covered.
Yes.
And so you've got books about drugging children. There are, in my library, I've probably got 50 books about the harm that these drugs are doing. Maybe the best one is this one called Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Yes.
Where Robert Whitaker, who is a award-winning journalist, medical writer,
Yes.
went through the research and found that these drugs have caused this epidemic of mental illness. And what's happened is that the rate of people that are categorized as disabled because of being diagnosed with mental illness has gone up 6 times on a per capita basis since the introduction of the so-called miracle drug Thorazine in 1954. And there's this paradox, which is the drugs knock down the symptoms in the short term, but in the long term, they dramatically worsen outcomes. And so there's just a huge amount of money. I mean, I'm trying to think, in the statement of facts, this Depakote sold $15 billion. So there's just so much money on the other side. And you've actually got a lot of well-minded people that are trying to get this message out.
What can the state do to address this problem?
Well, we need to support our children. And one of the things...
How do we do that?
We need to spend the time with them to help raise them. I mean,
So is
that's
this
the short
anything-
answer.
But what about, should the government step in? Should the government step in and say, okay, this is 95% of kids going to psychiatrists getting drugged? Shouldn't this, is it, if ever anything screamed for regulation, wouldn't it be this?
Well, one of the really interesting things is that most of the psychiatric drugs given to children and youth on Medicaid is not really allowed under Medicaid.
It's not.
No, and the government, throughout the government, is refusing to enforce that restriction.
And this is via state regulations or
How
under
come?
Medicaid.
Why are they not enforcing that?
Because there'd be this outcry, oh, you're not going to allow us to give these drugs that our psychiatrist says we need to give.
I see.
Okay, and the other thing that happens is that in school, a child might be acting out, and they're not really supposed to do this, but basically there's pressure brought to bear on the parents to drug the children. And a more affluent, wealthy parent, that has status in society can stand up to that,
Sure.
but a poor parent can't.
Yeah.
And, God help a child that's in foster care, because those parents don't have
Because
any power.
they'll lose the foster child if they don't drug the child.
There's a couple things that happen. One is they're threatened that if they don't drug the child will be taken away from them, saying that you're neglecting their medical needs.
Unbelievable.
And if they're in foster care already, in Alaska, unless the parental rights have been terminated, the parent still has the right to, has to give consent to give the drugs, but they're coerced into that. And one parent told me her signature was forged, but they're threatened with having their parental rights terminated if they don't go along. And these threats are carried out.
Are you making any progress fighting this issue?
I don't think so. We were handing out this, maybe a little bit. I mean, we were handing out this flyer at the governor's picnic, you know,
Yeah.
tell Governor Parnell to stop drugging children.
Yeah.
And they got pretty upset about that. And I have this sticker here, you probably can't see it. And we were handing these out, and the kids loved it. And you know, in the line going to to meet the governor, and they got real upset about it, and they threatened to call the police on us.
Have you talked to Governor Parnell about this issue?
Well, that's interesting. He agreed to convene a roundtable and to get us to quit passing these out. And then, so we did. And since then, he has reneged on that.
What would
Why?
you like for?
Because he doesn't think it's true, or he
What
doesn't
would you
want
like
the
for
pressure?
him to do?
Well, I think that there needs to be a task force set up, and I've recommended three people, 2 psychiatrists and this very preeminent social worker to come up and help the state design it. There's a psychiatrist by the name of Tony Stanton who ran this program in Northern California called Seneca, and he took the children that had failed multiple placements and were just the most worst behaved and on multiple drugs, and he was able to get all of them off the drugs and all of them really back on an even keel.
Yeah.
And then what he found, and he's got a chapter in this book.
Yeah.
And what he found, and then he was asked, well, what happens, you know, then how did it go from there once they got
Right.
released? And what he said, it depended on the environment to which they were, you know,
So
sent to
what
after
would you
that.
like specifically Governor Parnell to do?
Well, I think we have to arrange a program to help, you know, to help parents help their children.
So help
basically.
parenting.
So,
help
yeah, I mean,
parents parent.
yeah,
And
basically.
explain to them that there's an option other than drugging your kid.
Right.
There are
And,
skills that you can employ.
and we have this really great resource in the state, this therapist by the name of George Stone, and he ran a program in Kotzebue, and he ran a program in Nome and Barrow, and he reduced the out-of-state placements by out of home placements by 70% in both places, and he put a team together. And they, you know, when there were problems, they would go in and help the family.
You know, it seems to me that, you know, I'm a big believer in the free market. And if 95% of psychiatrists are drugging their kids, if a psychiatrist would come out and say, you know what, I'm going to actually treat your child. I'm going to counsel with them. I'm going to work with them. I'm going to give you skills as a parent. I'm not going to drug your kid. It seems to me that would be a model that would attract people. Now, I hear what you're saying. If you're low income and you're poor and you're, you know, it's probably a little different story. But is that one way to go with this? Just to have some psychiatrists stand up and say, you know what, I'm not going with the status quo. I'm not going with the conventional wisdom.
Well, I think there are some psychiatrists who are doing that, and they're just not being supported. And so there's this Tony Stanton, there's this child psychiatrist, Marty Irwin, who I suggested the state consult with, and they brought him in, and he made a bunch of recommendations.
Are there any?
And the states ignored them.
Are there any psychiatrists in Alaska like that?
Child psychiatrists? Not that I know of. Okay. There's an adult psychiatrist. There's a couple of them. I mean, I've worked with.
We'd like to get some names. Get them on.
Okay, great.
Jim Gottstein, do you have any events coming up or anything that how do people get involved with what you're doing? I imagine there are people who are watching this who are very unhappy about the situation, may want to get involved in some way. How do people get in touch with you?
Our website has a lot of information, PsychRights.org, PsychRights.org.
Okay.
We did a film series last winter, from January through April, and with these films that showed alternative programs, and we had kind of a disappointing turnout. I mean, I was here promoting that, and so we're trying to figure out how to get people, because I think that really educating the public about what's really going on is the most important thing.
Yeah, definitely. Keep up the good fight. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that, and it's just always so fascinating to talk to you. It's disturbing, because you just never hear this. It's just, what a tragedy. That we're making kids zombies because we don't want to love them.
Well, we're creating this huge class of disabled, brain-damaged children, and we have no idea what's going to happen to them later in life. But basically, what's happening is that children, youth in the child mental health system just kind of automatically get put into the adult system, and we're turning a huge percentage of them into permanent mental patients. That's their career as a mental patient. And it doesn't have to happen. At least 80% of the people that become permanent mental patients could get on with their lives and become productive citizens with relationships and all that kind of thing. And we're just taking these people.
Why do you do this?
Why do I do this? I think it's the right thing to do, basically. I mean, I feel that I was very lucky not to have been made permanently mentally ill by the system. I had a psychotic break in 1982 when I was 29, when I was 29 in 1982, and ended up at API for a month. And I was told I would never get better. Those that those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never be able to do that again. And when I told them that I'd gone to Harvard Law School, that confirmed for everybody else that I was delusional. And so I was just really lucky. I was this close to being made a permanent mental patient. And so I feel kind of an obligation to give back, because I've really had a very lucky life, blessed life, a privileged life, and I see all these people that are being just horribly mistreated, and I just don't think it's fair.
Good for you, man. Good for you. Thanks, Jim.
You bet.
Jim Gottstein. We'll take a break. Dan Fagan Show. Stay with us. That was a disturbing conversation. We just had Jim Gottstein on, who is with, what was the organization?
The Law Project for Psychiatric Rights.
And he said 95% of kids who go to psychiatrists are drugged. And his thought on it was that because it's so much easier to drug a kid than treat a kid, so much easier to drug a kid than raise a kid, so much easier to drug a kid than love a kid. And it's become an epidemic, and what happens is a lot of these kids become permanent mental patients.
Yes.
Because these drugs have such deteriorating effects on you. It's heartbreaking. Hey, I got tons of calls back in here, but let me get some of these. Go ahead, Rihanna.
I'm a child that was brought up in a family of mental illness, and so the issue is that I was suffering through a traumatic marriage, and OCS got involved in it, and they took my children, and they're in foster care. And before that, they took my children like 3 times from me. I'm not the abuser or the person causing the trauma, but it has traumatized me to the point where I went to college, and I got my life together. I go to church, and I'm not understanding the reason why. And I don't understand why they can do this to me when I'm not a perfect parent, but I'm a loving parent. I don't abuse my children. And I want to know what is the outlook of me becoming a better person through, like Jim Gottstein, like giving me some referrals to doctors that would help me become a better person if they say I'm not.
Well, why did they tell you they took your children?
They said that I had mental illness, and that was it. You deal with it. You have mental illness. You're not a parent. But I've been to college. I'm a PCA. I'm on my own business. I'm not the abuser. I have never abused my children. And
have you secured an attorney?
No, I can't afford it.
Yeah, I think you could probably get one appointed to you by the government if you can't afford it.
No, the deal is that I have one, but they're so close linked, the agency, and that they're working together against me, because my attorney keeps telling me, well, the kids are better off with a family member.
Yeah.
Well, I would maybe consider contacting Jim Gottstein, the gentleman we just had on the show, to see if he has any suggestions for you in that area.
Yes, but I don't know his number. I'm elated to talk with him, but
What was his
not
website?
sure.
He's with the Law Project of Psychiatric Rights. Here, I'll give you his website. It
Okay.
is PsychRights.org.
Yeah, I would just Google that and then get in touch with him, and hopefully he can help you out. Xenia.
Yes, hello, it's Xenia.
Xenia. Hi, Xenia.
Hi, I caught the tail end of Dr. Gottstein's when he was on there, but drugged children. I agree with him. Years ago, a few years back, I had a relative at API, and I went to visit her to check on her, and I never went there before, but when I went there, she was so drugged, I didn't even know. She didn't know who she was, or didn't know me half the time.
Yeah.
It was a horrible experience. As soon as I got out of there, I went to her social worker and to other people to help get her out of there. I said, they got her so drugged, I don't think it's going to help her. She's going to end up in there forever.
Well, what Jim Gottstein says is that it creates permanent mental patients, because these drugs are just so debilitating, and especially when it comes to children. Kim, you're on. Kim, you're on.
Good morning, Dan.
Morning.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. You hit my hot button today. I watch you all the time, and I love your show.
Thank you.
But you finally hit my hot button. Jim is a wonderful man. Known him a long time. Known about his project for a long time. And we went through some similar things. In 1972, I was committed to API and put on heavy 1,000 milligrams a day of Thorazine. Knocked to the floor. They call it the Thorazine Shuffle. That's all you can do all day long. It's just shuffle across the floor. It's for control purposes. There are, more patients than what they want to deal with. So they put them all on these massive doses of Thorazine. Now, here's the gig. If you don't like it, guess what? You can't say no.
Yeah.
And then if you do say no, which I was prone to saying no, they do the all male aids to Ward 1 call. And about 15 big guys throw you to the ground and they shoot you up with the drug. And that takes care of you for the day. I was one of those who protested every day. And well, to make a long story short, after 4 years of being committed to API and being under that kind of drug control, a social worker came along by the name of Jerry Essex. He said, take him off everything. Take him off everything. And they released me 6 months later. And I became a very productive citizen of this community, started a huge company, put on hundreds of concerts, and entertained thousands and thousands of people here. So that's just a short, quick story, one glimpse of one person's life. And this is happening.
Well, Kim, how did the social worker know that you'd be okay without the drugs? Why did he single out you?
I can't answer that question, Dan. He just knew.
Yeah.
He just knew. And I was on, you name it, lithium carbonate, which was a new drug that they knew nothing about. You had to be shot up with it. It was a lead-based drug, so if you got too much, you would die.
Wow.
I'm sorry, Dan. What'd you say?
No, I just, that's an incredible
I
story.
appreciate your story.
Well, that's really Jim Gottstein's story. He said
Yes,
when he was in
but
API.
Jim was blessed. It only spent a month.
Yeah.
I had to do 4 years before I came
Wow.
out. And again, I want to say that I love Jim dearly for what he's doing, because people just are not responding to this issue.
Yeah. Well, it's the easy way out. It's so easy to drug somebody. I appreciate it, Kim. Thank you. It's just such a tragedy. It's just such a tragedy. 868-8914. And Barrow, Joe.
Hello?
Hello, Joe.
Yeah, Mike, I got a wife and a son who are both schizophrenic. They've up here in Barrow, we have a behavioral health system that is horrible. I mean, I think they just go through the motions. We've got a psychiatrist up here that just sees them for maybe 5 minutes at a time, once a month, and then they just renew the prescription for this Risperdal. And my wife pretty much is in her bedroom, laying down, almost 24 hours a day. My son is the opposite. He'll stay up all night and walk around and pace back and forth, and then he sleeps all day. And that's a cycle. And I've asked the psychiatrist to take him off if this was Risperdal, but they refuse. And I talked to other people and I say this is what these psychiatrists do, is that they just give everybody Risperdal, and they resist trying to change the drug.
And
one of the doctors that
how old's your son?
He's 28.
Can your wife and son refuse the drug?
I imagine they can. That's one of the patient's rights, that they can refuse the drug. But if they're off the drug, then I've got more problems after that.
What kind of problems?
Well, the voices that they have come back, and they get agitated and just tough to live with. But there's got to be something else out there that they can do. And just hearing Jim talking earlier, this is what I suspected of the drug. It's like a little straitjacket.
Mental straitjacket. Yeah. In Kenai, Mike.
Yeah, good morning, Dan.
Morning.
Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about what goes on in API, Alaska Psychiatric Institute here in the state of Alaska.
Okay.
I had a family member that spent 30 years inside of API, and he had changed their policies, for things that he'd done. But he'd tell me after the 30 years of being in there that they'd come out and he'd be watching TV in a group room, and they'd walk right up to him and say, "You want to make trouble? And if you want to make trouble, we'll take you in and give you a shot of this, calm you down, and put you in the room." All kinds of mental, playing with him mentally, so that if he did say that he wanted, if he was angry, if he was mad, he'd wind up in the room under those heavy drugs. There is no oversight in API. They are judge, jury, and prosecutioner.
Well, Mike, when you think about it, you're working in a home, and there are people there that you would consider unstable, and there's two ways to stabilize them. You can work with them and build relationships and try to work through their problems, or you can give them a pill. The easy way is to give the pill. And this is really, in my opinion, this whole drugging phenomenon is the easy way out. It cuts the work out of the deal. You just hand somebody a pill.